Welcome to Podcasting Smarter, the podcast for podcasters by podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Hello and welcome to Podcasting Smarter. This is Norma Jean Belenke, Podbean's head of events. And in today's episode, we're having a conversation with Roger Nairn, the founder and CEO of Jar Audio, where we'll talk about branded podcasts, why to have them, best practices, impact, how to get started, and so much more. Stay tuned, and here we go. Hi, Roger. How's it going?
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. We're so excited to chat with you today. Jar Audio produce some of the top branded podcasts out there. So this is a real treat for everyone out there who is thinking, oh, what goes into a branded podcast? What are some of the larger brands doing? What does impact look like? We're here to talk about that today. So first off, tell us about your background and how you got into podcast production.
Yeah, well, about 5 years ago, I was working in the advertising world. I was in leadership positions in client service. I was in the advertising for almost 20 years, working for some of the world's biggest agencies. But I started getting a bit of a bug. Honestly, the idea of sort of traditional advertising was starting to wear me down a little bit. I thought brands could do a way better job having better conversations, more engaging, thoughtful, creative opportunities to connect with their audiences. And when I met my business partner, Jen, it just kind of clicked. Jen came from the journalism space. She was a CBC journalist for many years, which is sort of the Canadian equivalent of NPR. She was also teaching podcasting at the University of British Columbia. And we got thinking one day, what if we were to combine our forces and take, my marketing experience and her storytelling experience and combine the two to create Jar Audio? And that was over a beer, and we were off to the races from there.
Amazing. And the name Jar Audio, is it an acronym?
It is. We actually started out with three partners. It was Jen, Aaron, and Roger, and that's where Jar came from. It's actually a really cool story for those that are looking to start a business one day. We literally did have that conversation over a beer, but I said to everybody, listen, if we're going to try this business thing, I want to just go slowly and just see if there's any interest first. So that night, I went home and I sent 10 messages out on LinkedIn to 10 people that were in my community, not necessarily best friends, just some people that I kind of randomly picked up. The second person to respond said, "You're never going to believe this, but my wife is looking for this exact service for her business. Can you be in her office on Thursday?" We were in her office on Thursday. It turns out the company is Sage Natural Wellness, one of the world's largest aromatherapy companies and retailers. We had an amazing meeting with them. They said, "Can you send us an estimate?" We said, "Absolutely." Now, of course, an estimate needs to come with probably a logo that goes on it. We didn't have a name at the time, so the question became, what are we going to call ourselves? And the first thing we came up with was Jar Audio, because it is an acronym. Now, the marketer in me, the brand guy in me, kind of finds that a bit maddening because it's, I personally think acronyms are a little bit lame, but the entrepreneur in me loves that because that's literally how the company started. And we slowly built from there.
Yeah, it's such a fun story. But also, I think, when I think of Jar Audio, not knowing the story before this moment, I always think like, oh, a podcast in a jar.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great, ways that we talk about it. The other thing my partner likes to say is you also put a jar up to a door to kind of listen through it. You can kind of mimic like a headphone almost. You put a penny in the jar, you put stories in a jar. There's a number of things you do with jars.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And tell us next about how Jar Audio and how the company approaches creating branded podcasts for your clients, because for everyone out there listening, it can be a real process for brands.
Yeah. So the very, very first thing we do, and the thing that I think makes us stand out amongst other agencies in the brand podcast space, is we really zero in on what is the business problem we're trying to solve with this podcast. Now, you can imagine that is going to be, varying dependent on the business, the vertical they're in, the situation they're in at the moment. But we really zero in on that first through our rigorous strategic phase. Then we answer the question of like, who's our audience? Really dig into the audience and ask ourselves, what does that audience need? And then we try to marry up the need of the audience with what the brand that we're working with is able to provide. So perfect example is we worked with Expedia for a podcast called Out Travel the System. They came to us and said, listen, we've got a business problem. That is that our audience doesn't see us as a very helpful brand. Now, this is pre-COVID. They said, we want to change the brand, the brand studies that we're doing to show that we are a more helpful brand. Can you help us with a podcast that would do that? So we sat down, researched their audience. You're absolutely right. They didn't see them as much of a helpful brand. And so then we craft the show to be a show that provides a ton of value to that audience in the form of travel tricks, tips on how to get the most out of your travel experience. Now, the important piece is that it's not about Expedia. It's not about Expedia, deals. Now, every once in a while, we might involve an Expedia expert, but let's be honest, there's very few brands that know travel better than Expedia. So we'll use them quite sparingly, but we also leverage them as much as possible because they are able to provide a ton of value. And so we're really crafting the podcast to be as great of a podcast first that just happens to be brought to you by that brand. So it's very much about digging into and creating an amazing bedrock of strategy before we get into production.
Yeah, absolutely. And that problem is a really interesting one, right? People didn't think they were very helpful. That's really interesting, right? Because people go to a travel website to get help, right? To find a flight, to find a hotel.
Yeah, but they also, I think at the time they were being seen as more of the place to go for deals, and that can be fine, but then that becomes a bit more of a commoditized action online. And so they want to be known as a bit more of a travel partner. And so the podcast was meant to be that tool and that resource. So we can, because a branded podcast is all about creating long-term relationships with audiences so that down the road, when they are making their purchase decisions, they've already got a nice memory to connect themselves to your brand. And so that's where we see the value of a podcast mostly lying is kind of in the top of funnel, either brand awareness or brand affinity side of the funnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And for businesses out there, for people out here listening, who maybe work for a business, how do a lot of companies go about identifying these problems that they can solve with podcasting?
Yeah, I think so much of it is, as a business owner myself, we're constantly running into challenges in our business. But I think also with, coming out of COVID, with the AI conversation just hitting us all head on and the economy, a little bit of a question mark right now, I think this is a perfect time for businesses to get a bit introspective and ask themselves sort of, how's our brand doing? How can we improve it? Because the other thing a podcast is great for is improving brand positioning and thought leadership. So if there's a certain area you want to have more thought leadership in, and I kind of hate that term, but if you want to be known a little bit better for a certain topic, a podcast can be a great way into that. And it's really important to recognize that doesn't necessarily, like when I say, thought leadership or they want to be known for a certain topic, that doesn't necessarily mean that has to be a business topic. Brands these days we think it's imperative that they get more involved in some of the more political conversations, the LGBTQ plus conversation right now, or, just equity as a whole. Those are the conversations that we think should be happening more as a whole throughout the world. Because I think part of the problem, in the world these days is that we're not doing enough. There isn't enough dialogue. There's just a lot of yelling from one side of the fence to the other. And I think brands should very much include themselves in that conversation as well, because they are such an important part of society and obviously have a huge influence on society. So if it's a conversation about climate, there's absolutely a reason why, Patagonia and REI and different brands should be having those conversations. Or if it's a conversation about the economy, some of the financial institutions should absolutely be part of that conversation. So the list goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you walk us through your process for developing a podcast concept and bringing it to fruition for some of the brands that you work with? Because it is quite an involved process.
Yeah, it is. Getting into the weeds, pre-COVID, we would travel all around the world and sit in a boardroom with our clients for a day and a half to 2 days and get out the whiteboards with the colored markers and start plotting together, what this podcast should be about. Because it's really important for us that we be as collaborative as possible. And like I talked earlier before about listening, listening is our number one value. So we really believe in listening to our clients and really understanding their brand and their audience. Now, COVID changed things a little bit. So we've now taken that sort of model and that strategy workshop, and we do it mostly online through Zoom and other forums. So we break it down into 4 to 5 2-hour sessions. The first few sessions are spent really digging into the brand. What's the brand problem we're looking to solve? How is the brand positioned in the market? Does that do you want to change? Who's your competition? What are they doing in the podcast space or have done in the past with podcasts or maybe other forms of audio or short form storytelling? We then dig into who the audience is. A lot of times we ask our clients to provide us with any existing persona work that they might have. There's a lot of really great things that some organizations have done to help us understand who exactly their audience is. We then do a scrub of like what other podcasts are they listening to. We then really dig into, knowing what we know now, where are there some opportunities, for lack of a better term, what's the blue ocean that we want to tap into from a podcast perspective? And then we start concepting from there. Concepting starts with our clients. We like to have them part of the conversation. So we brainstorm some ideas together, but then we really take it back, and our creative team, led by my partner, Jen, who's our chief creative officer, develop concepts. And we really look at like different Jen likes to call them eddies, like a river rafting term, but different avenues that the creative could go down. We look at different formats. We look at sort of what the audience is already listening to, and we make an assessment of whether those sort of formats are working or not. And then we come to the client typically with 3 concepts that we fleshed out, including hosts and guest ideas. The client typically, and then with that, we'll have a recommendation for which of those 3 we recommend. The client will choose a direction or provide us with feedback, in which case we'll make revisions. And then once you've got a direction, we put that all into what we call sort of the show Bible or a show plan, which kind of acts like a bit of a brief for our entire company and the client to sort of move forward with the podcast. And so the way I like to think of it is that if anybody were to ever get sort of airlifted into the project, they could pick up this Bible and understand exactly what the podcast is going to be about and what needs to be done. And then we get into production from there.
Yeah. So there's a lot of market research too. There's a lot of market research. So, and I think when we're listening to a podcast, we don't always understand how much work has gone into, hey, this is your audience and we want to make sure that you're actively engaged and that the format is a specific format that we know you're going to follow. And that the content meets specific parameters, both for the brand and for the audience and for the overall market.
Yeah, like nobody ever wants to hide the fact that, as much as this is supposed to be an amazing podcast first, that happens to be brought to you by a brand, it is a marketing tool. And so as a marketing tool that you're investing in, it needs to perform. And in order for it to perform, it has to be correct for your audience, done with, exquisite technical ability. It has to sound good, it has to resonate. And so we do everything possible to give the podcast its best opportunity to be successful.
Yeah, absolutely. And very quickly, I know this isn't specifically your wheelhouse, but on the production side, can you give us just a little bit of I want to say like a taster or like an appetizer of what the production process looks like as well? Because a lot of branded shows are impeccably produced. And I mean, the great thing about podcasting, you can start a podcast in 5 minutes from your phone at Podbean, but you can also spend thousands and thousands of dollars per episode with so many different sound editors, sound designers, composers. So tell us a little bit about what that production looks like from a branded standpoint for some of the stuff that you guys have done.
Yeah. So when we have our show Bible sort of greenlit and ready to go, a producer is assigned to the podcast. That producer's job is to develop the story arc of the show. They're working with either a chase producer or a production coordinator who's helping with the heavy lifting when it comes to guest outreach. So in the case of Jar Audio, we will reach out to guests, but we have some backup guests ready to go should that guest not be available. It's really important, I think, for organizations not to organize their podcast production around the hopes and dreams of getting the super famous guest that they always wanted. It's not to say try, but don't pin the entire production around the hopes of being able to get Prince Harry or Oprah, because there's a good chance it might not happen, and therefore you need some backups and you need to keep the ball rolling from a production standpoint. So, anyways, once we
sorry, just really quickly, it's so important for every podcaster, I think, to remember that, because and we talk about this all the time here at Podbean. Like, we've done live events on getting celebrity guests and getting high profile guests, and it can really help, but also it's something where it's sometimes the guests that have the most notoriety are not listened to as much, or they have less incentive to promote the show. There are a lot of facets there.
Totally. Yeah, it's a bit more muddy to get into. With our guests, we do 90% of our recording remotely. And because we want the absolute best audio quality, we'll do a bit of a tech check with our guests in advance of the interview. And if they don't have the right equipment, or if we're not happy with their audio quality, we'll actually ship them equipment. We've got a bit of a package that we put together and ship it all around the world quickly. Once they get that equipment, we set them up with it, make sure that they've got the right recording environment. We actually use that equipment also as a bit of a thank you for them being a guest on the show. So they get to keep that equipment, or if they've got other equipment or they don't want it, we recommend that they donate it to a local school. We don't want to waste it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, what are you shipping out? What is there a specific?
We're sending out typically. I mean, I don't want to drop too many brand names, but it's a pretty good quality USB microphone, and then a good set of headphones. And in some cases, we're sending like a large microphone ball that goes over top of it if we have to be working in a pretty echoey environment. And then in some cases, depending on the situation, we'll send them a boom as well, something to keep the microphone in front of their face.
I'm going to ask for details. What's the mic?
It's usually a Rode Mini.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but for everybody out there, it's good to have context, right? I think there's a lot of different products in the market.
I think Rode Minis are fantastic, and they're easy to use, and they're we have very few issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a mic for literally every situation, every person. I mean, I'm currently talking to you today from my Shure MV7. It's really something where, like, in terms of microphones, it's so fun to hear about what everyone's using, how they're using it, best practices for the mic. I know, it's a little bit of a niche thing, but I think we all in some way nerd out about microphones.
I'm talking to you from the same microphone as well.
Amazing.
Yeah.
We're microphone twins, but it's definitely something where I think in terms of consistency, if you can, and we've had some companies talk about this, Slalom Consulting utilizes Podbean's enterprise platform, and they spoke to us last year about this and how when they have guests on the podcast, they'll ship out a package, a microphone, headphones, whatever specifically is needed for that recording. And so for everybody out there, maybe you don't have budget, maybe you do. It's definitely an interesting concept in terms of creating audio consistency.
Yeah. And we do it and budget it into our projects and do it as if we're never going to see that microphone again. And it's going to stay with the guest. You can also create a package with a return shipping label and have it sent back to you. That's absolutely something that can be done.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's such a great tip, I think, for everybody out there doing remote recording, whether you're shipping a microphone and, if you have the budget to buy an extra mic or two, ship it to someone with a return label, or if you have the budget as a gift, I think it really creates consistent sound within your show as well.
Oh, I totally agree. It keeps our technical team very happy.
Yeah.
once we've gotten the interview scheduled, we record the interview. In advance of our interviews, though, we will pre-interview our guests. It typically happens during the tech check, but we'll pre-interview the guests. And the pre-interview is an opportunity for our producer to really dig into the channels and opportunities that our host can have in the conversation. We don't script any of our podcasts, but we do go into our podcast interviews with a question line that we're comfortable with, and it gives us a bit of a roadmap for the conversation. So coming out of that, we'll put together that cue line, we'll give it to the host, we'll brief the host, walk them through some scenarios on how the conversation should go. But we do want it to feel as natural as possible. So we don't control anything going into that conversation other than, areas to poke around. We then do the recording. The recording for us is mostly done on Riverside. That gives us the opportunity to have our clients join the call or join the interview. They sit in the audience, and that gives them an opportunity to just feel comfortable knowing that the right questions are being asked and the conversation's going, in a direction that that brand is comfortable with. That being said, we do keep them arm's length to the point where, we're not controlling the interview by any means. It's more
they're muted, right?
Yeah, it's more just so that they can provide feedback, and it's a bit quicker for the production process.
Yeah.
And so then coming out of that interview, we then go into a series of rough cuts and fine cuts and final versions for upload.
Yeah. Amazing. And once the podcast is out there, it's been launched, people are listening, the brand is happy. How do you measure the success of a branded podcast, both for the company and for JAR?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So a lot of that work is done in our strategy workshop up front, where we're really digging into the client and understanding what success looks like for them. And I'll tell you, success can vary widely. I've seen a lot of different ideas of what success looks like. For example, a lot of clients are obviously looking for the vanity metrics of downloads and unique listeners and all that sort of stuff. So we're for sure, looking at the same thing. From a JAR standpoint, our idea of success is a long listen length or the consumption number. Again, because this is a marketing medium, we want to make sure that the audience is listening for as long as possible. But that also tells us, and it tells our creative team, and it tells everybody that's touched the podcast that it's interesting and people want to be engaged with the content. And, we're really lucky to be able to say that a lot of our shows see upwards of 95% listen through rate, which is testament to our team and their storytelling ability and their ability to keep an audience's brain fresh while they're listening. And I say that jokingly, but there are a lot of different sort of ways to do that through an episode. But then the success can, I've also seen success come out of clients' mouths a number of different ways. For example, we had a client I'm not going to say the brand, but a very large organization, quite, I'd say, sort of organizationally cumbersome, let's say. And their idea was success was to just make a podcast and have it go live, because they thought it would be quite difficult to do that internally. And it would have to go through a bunch of legal loopholes, or not loopholes, but a bunch of legal hurdles.
Yeah,
and
procurement.
To executive and a procurement. And honestly, the process was that they were just floored with how easy the process was with us. And the podcast got launched and it's live, and they're so happy about that.
That's a really great point.
It's funny though, now they're like, oh, now we're interested in, the engagement level and the downloads. Right. And we're like, well, that's not what you said. Some of those like important metrics like audience size, let's say, is going to be different for a client. So we've had some very, very niche B2B clients. The Port of Vancouver is a perfect example. Port of Vancouver is one of the largest ports in the world. And for them, their audience was the 25 companies that operate within the boundaries of the port and the staff that goes with it. So we're talking like a couple thousand people. So for them, they're looking at like hundreds and hundreds of downloads versus the, hundreds of thousands of downloads. And so for them, it was really a smaller number. For other clients, we've had, conversion be, the goal, and they want to see people go from the podcast to their website, and we're able to track all that. And so that's what they see as success. So yeah, it could totally vary.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to remember that there's so many ways to use podcasting, right? Whether it's you want the most people to hear about something, you want a niche specific group of people to hear about something, you want direct clicks on your website, whatever it is, podcasting can deliver. And it's important to be clear about that on the front end, but also know that, not every success is 1 million downloads, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, we're also very open and honest with our clients that it is a branded podcast and, it's not This American Life. And the audience is going to be a little bit skeptical going in.
Yeah.
And they should be prepared. They should be prepared for that. And so the numbers aren't going to be astronomical. That being said, I mean, we believe wholeheartedly that there will be a branded podcast one of these days that is, a This American Life. That is a popular podcast to that level. To that level, it's only a matter of time because brands have access to incredible storytellers, incredible stories. They have access to celebrities and influencers. They've got access to thought leaders. Like they have the recipe to tell incredible stories that audiences want to listen to. The biggest problem is them. They get in their own way, and if they if they take the opportunity to really look deep into themselves and like what can we do, I think the day is going to come where the top podcast is coming from a brand.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting time for branded podcasts.
Yeah,
I think a lot of people, whether they're specific individual independent podcasters or their brands, have those This American Life thoughts in their head, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally.
And so it's nice though that there are shows out there that people aspire to, no matter what the genre is.
But to be fair to the brands, they don't know, right? And the the folks in marketing or communications or whoever's initiative this is, they don't know either. And so interestingly, I'd say for probably the first 3.5 years of our company, we had to spend a lot of time in education, educating brands about why branded podcasts, why they should spend their dollars, making their own show. And it's only been within the past sort of 1.5 years that the question is less, why a podcast? Now the question is like, why Jar Audio? And now it's a bit more competitive, and which we love, and this is amazing. But the education level has definitely increased.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I love what you said about, some clients, especially on the corporate side, really have to deal with maybe red tape or bureaucracy of getting things across the finish line in terms of a yes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in terms of procurement can be a real hurdle. So I think that outsourcing your podcast production is incredible. And it's interesting on the internal side at Podbean. Our enterprise platform is incredible. We have a great embeddable player. And when a lot of companies find out about it, they're like, oh, it's better than, what we had or what we thought might be a solution. So it's very interesting.
Totally. And I think that's where, working with an agency like ourselves comes in, because we've seen it all. We've seen every scenario. And what we'll do is highlight to our clients, depending on the type of client, the type of company they are and the vertical that they're in. I mean, we've worked with American Express, we've worked with Amazon, we've worked with IBM. Like we've seen all sorts of sizes of and sort of legal, hairy situations and things like that. So we're able to highlight like, hey, heads up, you might have, the legal team asking you about X, Y, and Z. Here's how we can support them. Here's how we can get some sign off by that, with them ahead of time, which will make the production process easier.
Absolutely.
Hey, you might have run into a challenge with procurement. Here's what we've seen in the past. So we're trying to support these folks, and we don't see them as adversaries. They're all just trying to do their jobs. And so we try to cut things off at the pass, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes what happens within larger organizations, and I think we'll probably both agree on this, is that someone comes to you and they're so excited about podcasting, and then they, it's such a large organization, they may not fully be aware of the entire timeline of procurement or InfoSec or anything like that. So
totally.
Yeah, absolutely.
InfoSec. Oh, InfoSec.
Yeah, for everybody out there listening, it's, information security when a large company acquires a vendor or Yeah, you've got to go through some like informational inquiries.
Where do you store your files? Who has access to those files? What's your security like in your office?
Yeah, there's
You
a
don't
lot of
have-
technical
You don't
questions.
have an office? You work from home? What's your security like at home?
Yeah, there's a lot of technical questions.
Totally.
Absolutely. And in terms of ROI and how brands are looking at getting that return on investment for their investment into branded podcasts, what does that look like?
Yeah. Typical marketer's answer is it depends. It
Yeah.
depends on the brand. It depends on what it depends on what success looks like for them.
Mm.
But if we're talking about, the lifetime, or even if we're talking about the value of a new customer, there's number of ways that clients are measuring that internally, but we're obviously able to measure that against either conversions or obviously the cost of the production itself. A lot of our clients, though, just see ROI as an increase in audience size or an increase in web traffic. But also a lot of clients see ROI as brand lift. And so we'll do a brand lift study. We work with outside firms. One of our favorites is Signal Hill, and they'll do an incredible brand lift study and be able to report back and show that the podcast has done its job from a brand lift perspective, or hasn't done its job. Obviously, sometimes ours do, but sometimes they don't. And so again, it really depends on sort of what the expectation of ROI is. It's a tough question to answer, much like a lot of other marketing content.
Yeah.
How do you tie it directly to the to that piece?
Yeah, because it's not advertising. You're not putting a promo code in, right?
No.
It's not a direct offer, right?
Totally.
It's very much about the values and the ethos of the brand and aligning that with the customer and their ethos.
Exactly. And again, it's top of funnel. So it's about brand lift. It's about brand awareness. It's about, thought leadership and education. Like it's just a little bit harder to pin down exactly. And I think brands are starting to understand that more. And they're coming to us saying, look, I understand I'm not going to be able to drive direct sales from the podcast out the gate immediately. We see this as more of a brand play. And so they understand that it's part of the larger ecosystem of their other marketing activities.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you share some examples of some of the branded podcasts that you guys have produced? I know you used the Expedia example, but you guys have done a lot of really cool stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, we do a podcast right now for Staffbase, which is an online platform to support internal communications professionals. We do a podcast for them called Infernal Communication, all about sort of the ins and outs of communication. We did an episode, a mock trial for Comic Sans, the font, and you can imagine, and actually, so this is a really good example of a podcast that is designed for a specific audience, which is internal communication folks. However, we've also created it so that its appeal is wider. So it's bringing a wider audience, closer to the brand. And that was part of the brief. We've also done we do a podcast with Amazon called This Is Small Business. The challenge that they came to us is that a lot of people don't realize just how much of a relationship Amazon has with small businesses. The large majority of businesses that sell through Amazon are small businesses, and Amazon wants to support small businesses. And so we created a podcast that is all about supporting small businesses. It's hosted by Andrea Marquez, who is actually a woman who is interested in starting a business herself, but hasn't started. So she's using the podcast as an opportunity to interview all sorts of entrepreneurs about the ins and outs of owning a business. It's everything from how do you get rid of your business partner to how do you scale to learning about the financial side of the business. And so it's super high value for small business owners, but also really anybody interested in business as a whole. And then we've done everything from a podcast with T-Mobile, all about it's called Mobile Diaries, and that T-Mobile is an interesting company because they obviously deal in mobile technology, but they recognize that the world is changing and mobile technology has such a massive impact on society for good and bad. And so they allowed us to work with a team to really dissect from sort of like an anthropological standpoint how mobile technology is impacting society. Everything from dating to how we work to our mental health. And so it's just a really interesting introspective look at that technology. We are also working with Allianz Trade, which is a global trade insurance company.
Yeah, they're an insurance company, right?
Yeah, I mean, which, just the thought of it sounds a bit of a snooze fest, right? However, we've created this super fun show called Wheel of Risk, and it's all about risk. It's all about risk in business, risk in, a number of different areas. So we tell a story of how a war in Ukraine, initiated by Russia, is impacting the shipment of goods from China to North America, and vice versa. So-and-so has a shipping crate full of, raw meat, and it's got to leave San Francisco by 2:30 in order to make it to the shores of Africa on a certain date. And if it doesn't leave by then, what sort of impact does it have on the global economy? And anyways, it's really, really fascinating. And so, we really love to dig into, where's there an opportunity for a really interesting story to tell?
Yeah.
And how can the brand just play a role in telling it? And it's important to recognize that, when you listen to our shows, it's not about Allianz Trade, or it's not about Amazon, or it's not about T-Mobile. They just happen to be bringing you those stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's almost like they're like a minor character in the story, which is really beautiful.
Exactly.
I love some of those examples because it really, not only like in the Amazon example, right? A lot of people see Amazon and they think Jeff Bezos, right?
Totally.
Right. And they're watching him like go to space and, like be a billionaire. But Amazon does have a huge marketplace with small businesses. And so it really does bring things back more into that message.
Yeah, exactly.
When you're seeing Jeff Bezos like literally go to space on his rocket, right? It's like, which totally. It really reframes the conversation for what the company does.
Exactly.
And then on the Allianz front, in terms of insurance, I mean, people think insurance can be really boring, but also the story of insurance is, how do we cover all of these interesting commerce global activities? So I think that there is kind of a peeling back of layers there and being able to tell stories that, involve the brand, maybe as a narrator or a secondary or tertiary character.
You nailed it.
Yeah. But they really get to, it's very cool. Very, very cool.
Thank you.
So in terms of branded podcasts, you mentioned, the first couple of years of Jar Audio, it was a lot of education and now it's more competitive. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the landscape of branded podcasts evolving from 2023 and forward?
Sure. I mean, it's definitely growing. You're definitely going to see a lot more brands, getting into the pool. I think, from a delivery standpoint, we're seeing a lot more that are entering the space as well. I think a lot of brands, though, they look at the podcast as something that they still see it as an opportunity to just create something and put it out there, and they just assume that it's going to get listened to. But there's, as millions and millions of podcasts these days. And so there really needs to be a really intense level of differentiation for their podcasts. And I worry that brands are just going to what I would call kind of two dudes at a Yeti type service to create their podcast. Do
you want to break that down?
Just a couple of guys in their basement that have done a podcast in their, themselves. And so a brand will go to them to just create it and put it up online. It's got to be thought of deeper than that. Not just the production, but the audience growth side of it. Like we haven't even gotten into the audience growth side where we see 50% of the lift being, making sure that it's getting into the right ears as many of the right ears as possible. And so I think, the differentiation comes in the level of strategy, and in our case, we're solving your specific business problem with the podcast. But I'm very, very, very bullish on the space, and I think we're going to see a lot more brands getting into it.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that audience growth side, I mean, it's something where so much market research and work has gone into, even pre-production. What is the podcast going to be about? Who's going to listen? What's the ethos? What are the values of the brand we want to communicate? Then you do all the production work, which is a whole other thing. And then you do have audience growth. So for everybody out there who, may not have the resources for Jar Audio, who's maybe an independent podcaster, what are some of the things you do in terms of audience development and growth?
Yeah. I mean, aside from crafting the story around the audience, which our audience growth, team plays a role in with our creative team. When it comes to launching and sustaining the growth of the show, we look at 3 buckets. We look at the owned opportunities of the brand, the earned opportunities of the brand, and then the paid opportunities for the brand. And so with owned, we're leveraging everything from the client's email database to their if some of our clients, like let's say it's bank, they've got branch locations. Well, let's leverage that. They've got a large amount of staff who all have their own networks and friends and family that can get the podcast seeded. So we're really digging into some of the low hanging fruit that the client owns and sort of leveraging the unfair advantage that they come to the table with. We're then looking at the earned opportunities. So things like social, we're looking at cross-promotion opportunities, really digging into, okay, what other podcasts is our audience listening to? Let's reach out to those and try to barter some opportunities to work together. And then we're looking at paid opportunities. A lot of our clients will give us a budget to spend, but first we're developing a plan for how best to spend it. We make a lot of buys on other podcasts or podcast directories, but sometimes we'll make more sort of traditional buys, whether it's, some display ads, or maybe there's an industry newsletter that we want to be in, or, we've even done some radio stuff here and there, or posters. It really depends on the brand and the audience and what's going to be right for them. Kind of over top of all this, we're looking at the look and feel of the show as well. So we're creating all the artwork for the cover art and all the collateral, and then we're executing all the those deliverables on a episode to episode basis. We're writing social posts. We're creating video if needed. We're doing all everything that we need to get the show out there.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of those things are really achievable for independent podcasters, right? Here at Podbean, we have the ads marketplace. You can advertise on over 35,000 shows that are hosted with Podbean. There's a lot of things that you mentioned that, big brands are doing, but they're not inaccessible to your average independent podcaster. You can reach out to other shows that have a similar audience. You can do guest swaps. You can do ad swaps. At Podbean, we have, the Podbean directory. You can purchase placement. There's a lot of really cool things
totally
that across the board podcasters can do. And it's really reassuring to know that big brands are doing that. At Podbean, we know that it works, right? And so
absolutely, yeah, we're taking those sorts of roles off our clients' plates, because a lot of these podcasts are done off the side of desks in organizations, and I think a lot of times they don't realize how much work goes into it. So where we come in really takes a lot of that work off the plates. But to your point, amateur podcasters or anybody out there that has their own podcast can do a lot of the things that we're talking about. We're just able to do it, directly with our clients and feed in a little bit better to their overall, marketing ecosystem, and we're able to work internally with their larger marketing team.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Roger, we ask everybody the same couple of questions here at Podcasting Smarter at the end of our conversation. So the first is, what podcasts do you listen to?
So a lot of my own, or a lot of our own. We've got about 25 in production right now. Right now, I'm really into a podcast called How Long Gone, which is 2 guys that it's kind of a blend of like pop culture with a little bit of comedy, with a little bit of like style and fashion and all sorts of different stuff. I'm also a huge fan of You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes and a couple other newsy type shows.
Nice. And where, in your opinion, is the industry headed overall?
So with definitely growth. However, I do see us becoming a lot more grown up and a lot more, what would I say, a lot more sort of professionalized, let's call it. So we're gonna see more things like ad standards and more industry overwatch, let's say.
Consistency.
And I think, consistency. Yeah. Thank you for that. And I think that's coming from the industry itself versus, other sort of outside influences, which I think is great. So, groups like Sounds Profitable and Pod News and IAB and all that, I think are doing a good job of allowing the industry or, being a part of the industry's sort of growth and consistency in a sustainable way. I also see the industry just becoming a little bit more, creative, like different types of shows, different ways of executing. We're breaking out of the mold of just, one-to-one interview styles and narrative. We're going to see more documentary style, and we're going to see more blend of audio and video. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to do like some choose your own adventure type shows with brands. In fact, we've got some technology that we're playing around with that we would love to connect with a brand on to create a choose your own adventure type podcast. Things like that where we're leveraging, new technology to make the listening experience more rich.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Roger Nairn, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Podcasting Smarter. If you have any podcasting questions or want to get in touch, send us an email at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Thanks so much and happy podcasting.